Well, now let's continue to circle this central experience of where therapy or the need for therapy originates by looking at another aspect of it from the point of view of the child who's being instructed, who's growing up in the need for instruction as to how to be a self, how to be a human being in its adult stage. And obviously, if we look at it from this perspective, it's all about need. It's all about what the child needs to be instructed how to be a self. In other words, the day a child is born, I like to say that he or she is the most intelligent thing on earth, a human baby. And that intelligence and that ability to take in information is part of this multi-dimensional listening that we do with our minds, with our feelings, with our eyes, with our ears, with our bodies. And we're doing that from day one, so that we cannot overestimate how much learning, how much taking in any human child is doing. And I do believe, to repeat this point, that the present definition of babyhood, childhood, is radically inimical, hostile to what a child really is. Because we tend to think of them as these pinky little creatures, little baby, little booby, knowing nothing, and to be treated in that kind of dismissive way. I think I mentioned in a previous talk that I read an announcement about Mozart that he did his first public concert when he was only 6 years old, and that the lethal word in that announcement was only, because isn't it extraordinary that something so stupid and so talented as a human child should do something and he's only 6 years old, instead of celebrating the fact that, in fact, he had the kind of intelligence that a human creature does have at that age, and that he was merely manifesting it in a musical form. But more importantly, then, what that's pointing to is the fact that this ability to take in, this intelligence is there, but this creature is ignorant. It does not know stuff. And that's not the same thing as not being intelligent, that I don't know anything about Mongolian grammar. I'm ignorant of Mongolian grammar. Okay, doesn't make me stupid. It doesn't make me deficient. It means I haven't learned something. And that's what any human baby is. It's got no experience. It's got no awareness. It's got no learning about what goes on this planet. But he or she is taking that in as rapidly as this little wonder creature can do it. Now, what that means is there are aspects being added to the learning of this child as he or she goes through childhood to adulthood. And that is one of the major areas that sets up for the need for therapy and sets up emotional problems. In other words, I'm very influenced here, as is obvious to anyone who is aware of this stuff, by Heinz Kohut and the concept of self-psychology, because he talked about the need for children to form a sense of self by the recognition, the support that they get from adults. My own personal theory, opinion, is that he could have said more about how that operated and how that works, and that's what I'm addressing here. In other words, I think there are certain aspects of ourselves that we look to get supported and recognized in ourselves as we're growing up as children. I think a child needs to be warmed. I think a child needs to be held. I think a child needs to be treated what we call affectionately, and to know that the adults who are nurturing him or her are in his corner, in her corner, are supportive or positive, and so on. Very often clients will say, why didn't they like me? Why did they act so hostile to me? Because they're reflecting on what they in fact got instead of the kind of warm nurturing that they sought. But there's more to it than that. In other words, a child also needs to be recognized for being intelligent, for being sensitive, for learning certain things, for accomplishing each little thing. The cheering that naturally goes up when the child stands up. I remember my granddaughter making this big effort Go up on all fours and then raise herself up on her two legs and just glowed when we just kind of cheered and applauded when she accomplished this major feat. Does she know that, that's what we were doing? No. But did she take it in that her grandmother and I were standing around firing 21 guns because she stood up? She took that in. There was no question about it. She knew that she had that kind of support. And that's all along the way. I remember being at a graduation at a major Northeastern university, and a friend of mine was graduated magna cum laude, and his father, who was a killer, looked at his degree and said, "Well, I don't know, man. They seem to give out an awful lot of these magna cum laudes." I wanted to kill that guy, but I saw a repetition of the kind of castrating deprivation of any kind of recognition that this deficient, defective father was inflicting on his son. And I knew that boy very well, and that man, as he grew up, spent the rest of his life trying to make up for that defect in what he was because of what his father had told him. Now, what that does is there are recognition of your body, recognition of your looks, recognition of your sexuality, recognition of your energy, of your humor, of any talent that you have, any ability that you can develop. It needs to be explicitly recognized, explicitly mirrored, explicitly praised. And when you're filled with that kind of confidence, and you know it, well, then you have the confidence to seek and to give yourself things. In other words, you can look at somebody who's not in your family, who's not in your immediate circle, and say, well, gee, I admire that guy. I can be a fireman, or I can be a nuclear physicist, or I can be an astronaut, or I can be a major composer. No one in my family is a composer, but I can be, because I have the confidence to treasure myself and be myself. So there's a real sense of having oneself, that's having your own treasure, is the way I like to say it, having your own abilities. Now, what that means is that every child that's born is born with talents, abilities, treasures, the way I like to call them, and absolutely cannot lose, cannot shed, cannot be deprived of those treasures: intelligence, sensitivity, humor, awareness, love, sensuality, sexuality, etc. But he or she can be raised in such a way as to feel as though he or she has no right to those things, cannot have them, to some degree or other. And it can be done particularly. You can be as intelligent as Einstein, but you're not allowed to be as sexual as some rapacious sex creature. Don't do that. Or be as sexual as you can possibly be, but don't be intelligent. It can be done that way too, you see. Now, what that means is that children feel these things and take them in as they do. Now, I pointed out earlier that when people talk about the shooting that took place in Western Connecticut last year, nobody mentions the fact that he shot his mother first, you see. And that's really because the boy was so defective and so deficient that he's just unmentionable. But why did he shoot his mother first? No one asked that question. Recently happened in the Midwest. Again, a mother was shot. Oh, that's so terrible, the poor mother. And we do nothing to focus on what the responsibility of the parent is for that situation. What was inflicted on that kid that made him shoot his mother first? I'm not saying it's a nice thing to shoot your mother. What I am saying is there's a reason for it. And it's not just a random deficiency of character in the kid. There's something that he or she was not given, that was violated, that he or she is responding to in this. Now that goes on through the rest of life. In other words, the way I like to say it is that we all know, if we're dealing with another human being, man or woman, after a conversation, after a dialogue, after a relationship is over, it could be business, it could be just friendship, whatever, we all know, if we assess it, whether we feel plus or minus in response to that relationship. But we don't check that out enough, you see, to see. In other words, someone just told me I'm very intelligent. Does that feel positive? Or is he or she saying that to deprive me of it, to simply say, oh, well, you're such a smart ass. You shouldn't even be talking the way you are. You see, and the point is that, is the person doing it knowing? No, they're doing that? Is it conscious? No. Are they doing it? Yes. If they feel that they haven't been recognized, then they don't want to see anybody else have it. If they do feel they have been recognized, then they have it and they share it with the other. Now, so the way I say it is, at the end of any relationship, we're either both poor or both rich, you see. And that, by the way, goes a long way towards addressing the question of, do I get anything about doing anything? Speaking for myself, whenever I meet anybody who says to me, well, I don't want anything for myself here, I'm only thinking of you, my guard is up like nobody's business, because that person is dangerous. He or she does not know that every single thing that's said or done is done with a want, which is something that I want to have for myself, quite legitimately. The question is, when I want something for myself, have I been raised to think that that means you can't have anything, or I must take it away from you, or I must have it because I must get it illegitimately because it's not right for me to have it? Or does it mean that I can have it, that I can have something more and share it with you so we can both have it? All right? That idea alone goes a long way, as far as I'm concerned, towards addressing one of the major questions of therapy. Are you here because you've been robbed all your life, or you feel you should be robbed? You say, oh, you're not allowed to have anything. Now, a lot of that comes from the fact that the child, as he or she is being raised, drinks in what he's seeing, what he's experiencing. In other words, it can be done just by noticing, oh my goodness, look what a bad relationship my mother and father have. Am I going to have that kind of relationship if I have a marriage, if I have somebody in my life that's dear to me? You see, there's nothing specifically addressed to the child, but he or she just picks that up as a tonality that he observes in the world that's going on around him, which is not to say that if something's directly addressed to the child, that he or she is not going to feel that. In my view, for example, there is absolutely no justification whatever for hitting or physical violence for a child. There's nothing, whatever, ever taught to a child by simply slapping or hitting the kid. And anything that recommends that, as far as I'm concerned, is infinitely dismissible as any kind of document, any kind of statement about how to treat children. But the child will learn to have no respect, to have no safety, to have no sense of his or her bodily respectability. And so might go through life feeling that he or she cannot be respected, will always be shivering and always be holding back and be afraid of that kind of assault. Or conversely, he or she may go through life essentially aggressive and constantly kind of make up the defects of his own experience by inflicting that on another. It works that way. How else explain the fact that that kind of thing happens, you see, in this way? So the point is that anything anyone is doing, as far as I'm concerned, does not come from a floating set of symptoms that can be read in a book and somebody say, well, this person's delusional and has delusional persecutory fantasies and that kind of thing. It's always because something has really gone on in that person's experience. He or she may not know it, may not be aware of it, but it's happened, and he or she may be enacting it. So if we're looking at the caretaker's side of it as being the enacting of that kind of a dialogue, that kind of a drama, we look at it as the children's side of it, the learner's side of it here, as the recipients of that kind of a drama, and then what that receipt really means, what you come away with as a result. And my point is that in that dialogue, we're looking at two important aspects of what it is that motivates the need for therapy, for psychological working out and problem solving, fundamentally. And that, therefore, it's possible to see that in any therapeutic action, in any kind of exchange, it's not necessarily the right thing to just sit back and wait for the symptoms, the needs to come forward. Because if this child has learned never to have any needs, never to come forward, never to state them, then they'll never be stated. It cannot be assumed that however receptive or however quiet or however passive the therapist is, that the problems will come forward. I have a close friend who, in the time that I knew him, had the experience of 3 separate therapists. I have a relative who's been to 6 or 7, and at no time has my friend or my relative had the experience of having what he or she needed to be recognized to come forward. They couldn't bring it forward, and the therapist, well-trained therapist, just waited and waited and waited. Now, I'm not saying that intrusion on the part of therapists is always justified. What I am saying, there's times when there has to be an invitation if the person going for the emotional help has learned not to be invited, has learned to be disinvited. So again, that's another important aspect of what makes this process effective talk therapy.